I'm going to discuss Operation Barbarossa and the road to Pearl Harbor. And obviously, an immediate question is, what do they have to do with each other? Because Moscow is 10,000 miles from Pearl Harbor, and we have already seen that, in fact, there was a definite connection in American policy towards Japan and the events on the Eastern Front. And I think it is important to note that Roosevelt, many histories show or speak about Roosevelt as dividing the war into separate compartments, the Japanese theater and the European theater. But in fact, he thought about the war as a whole. And this was definitely true at the end of the war and when he was thinking about the post-war world, but also true in the preceding phase. And here is what he was saying to the ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, in January of 1941, which is, "We must recognize that the hostilities in Europe, Africa, and Asia are all parts of a single world conflict. We must recognize that our interests are menaced in Europe and the Far East. Our strategy must be a global strategy which takes into account every front and takes advantage of every opportunity to contribute to our total security." And I argue that in the fall of 1941, American strategy took into account what was happening on the Eastern Front and how that affected our relations with Japan. To set the backstory, as Dr. Thornton noted, there was the presence of Japan in Manchuria in 1931 onwards created a two-front war threat to the Soviets. And it was a direct threat to the USSR, and the rise of Hitler in 1933 heightened that threat. The 1936 Anti-Comintern Pact appeared to be an overt military alliance directed against the Soviets. The Soviet counter-strategy was to build up their forces in Siberia and fortify the area to deter Japanese attack, and to seek allies to isolate Germany and Japan, to deflect German and Japanese aggression away from Soviet borders, and to urge the Chinese to oppose Japan and keep the Chinese fighting, to keep the Japanese bogged down in China, and to split the anti-Soviet coalition diplomatically. At this time, the US response was limited to expanding the US Navy, which is the only instrument we had that could affect the Japanese. Now, Japanese planning against the Soviet Union from 1931 to 1941 is, I don't know how well you can see that in the light, but the first phase of the program is to eliminate the Soviet forces and bases in the maritime province there. By Voroshilov was a Soviet bomber base from which Soviet bombers could strike Japan. And as the Japanese were in Manchuria, the Japanese army was greatly outnumbered in air power relative to the Soviets. Any Japanese planning for war with the Soviet Union required the participation of the Japanese Navy. And especially if they had to break through fortifications, which they would have to, they would need additional air power. And phase two, after they had secured the area in the east, they move over to the west and defend in the mountains against any anticipated Soviet counterattack. Now, in the fall of 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, Hiroshi Oshima, was sending detailed reports to Tokyo describing German intentions and German progress in Russia. And he relayed Ribbentrop's requests for the Japanese to attack the USSR. And all that time, the United States is decrypting that information, and we're listening to these transmissions in real time. So we know what the Germans and the Japanese are talking about. So in the first phase of Operation Barbarossa, when it launches on June the 22nd, the German attack provokes a strategic debate in Japan, and the United States is following this debate via diplomatic decrypts. And on July 2, the Japanese tell the Germans that Japan is preparing for all possible eventualities regarding the Soviets in order to join forces with Germany in combating communism and destroying the communist system in Eastern Siberia. and the Japanese immediately begin heavily reinforcing Manchuria, which in fact our diplomats in Manchuria observed the Japanese forces moving north. And due to Siberian weather, the Japanese would need to decide by the middle of August whether or not to attack Russia in order to achieve their objectives before winter sets in. And so that's what's occurring during the Battle of the Frontiers, is the Germans are asking the Japanese to attack, and the Japanese are getting set up so that they can do that if they decide to. Meanwhile, at the same time, the United States is unsure what the Japanese will do. But we do know that Japan imported 90% of its oil, and we supplied the vast majority of it. We also knew very well that cutting off US oil would force Japan to attack Southeast Asia, the only accessible source of oil, before their stockpile was exhausted. And we knew the size of their stockpile and how long that would take because we sold them the oil in the first place. So earlier today, a gentleman asked if, or suggested that it was somehow a mistake that we cut off their oil and didn't know that would provoke an attack. I disagree. Our intent in freezing Japanese assets and embargoing the oil is to preclude the Japanese from moving north. And at the same time, as Dr. Thornton has already noted, we are creating a position of strength in the south. We begin reinforcing our ground units in the Philippines, and we call up the Philippine Army, place it under MacArthur's command. And meanwhile, Harry Hopkins, the president's advisor, visits Moscow, and Stalin tells him that the Soviets expect to hold the line of Leningrad, Smolensk, Kiev, Odessa, which is basically the red line you see there. In other words, Stalin thinks that as far as the Germans have gotten in July, he's going to stop them there until the winter. Didn't work out that way. So given that Stalin has told us that, our goal is to keep Japan in check until then. However, the Germans did not sit on their hands. In August and September, from Smolensk, they moved south to Kiev, encircled and destroyed some 700,000 Soviet troops, threatening the flank of the advance on Moscow. And then they resumed their advance in October, and they trap another 700,000 Soviet troops in the Battle of Bryansk-Vyazma, which is inside the red box there. And there's not much at all left between the German army and Moscow. And as we already heard, Stalin offers Hitler a separate peace based on he'd give up the Baltic states, Belarusia, Moldavia, and Ukraine, kind of similar to the Brest-Litovsk peace of 1917. But Hitler says, nope. And that provokes the evacuation of Moscow. And so meanwhile, we are observing this. And we also note from Washington that Tojo has replaced Prince Konoye as the prime minister. Tojo is well known for his anti-Soviet views, and we take this as an indication that the Japanese are going to attack the Russians. And we know that whereas the time has passed for a good weather attack on Siberia, we also know that the Japanese will attack Siberia anyway if Moscow falls, and it kind of looks like Moscow is about to fall. And at this time, FDR tells Churchill, I think the Japanese are heading north. In other words, he thinks they're going to attack the Russians. And we open negotiations with the Soviets to use Russian bases to begin bombing Japan if they attack. And at this time, Roosevelt orders accelerated reinforcement of the Philippines with B-17s, which we know, again, from the magic intercepts, that the Japanese are carefully counting every B-17 that lands in the Philippines. But just in case they didn't get the message, we leak our articles to the press saying that we are going to, American planes are going to bomb Japan from the Philippines and Russian bases. And at this time, the British support the effort to build positions of strength in the South by sending their Prince of Wales and their Repulse to Singapore. So at this critical time when Moscow is under threat, we have increased the level of threat in the South so that Japan can't ignore that and move north. On November 15, the German advance on Moscow resumes. And we, again, we know that Japan will attack Siberia if the Germans take Moscow, and we are afraid that's about to happen. And at this time, George Marshall briefs the press on our ability to bomb Japan from the Philippines. We will set the paper cities of Japan on fire. This story immediately appears in the New York Times, not by accident. We want to send that message. And by November 26th, the Germans are 25 miles from the Kremlin. And at the same time, the Japanese invasion fleet sails to invade Southeast Asia and secure the oil resources, and also the carrier strike force sorties from the Kurils. But at this time, we're not totally sure where that carrier strike force is going to go. And the modus vivendi, which we had negotiated when we were previously, was that Japan would agree to withdraw from southern Indochina in exchange for unfreezing assets and lifting the oil embargo. And at this time, after the Japanese invasion fleet sails, we say, none of that modus vivendi stuff. You're going to withdraw from China and Indochina and recognize Chiang Kai-shek as the only government of China, which we know very well is totally unacceptable to the Japanese, an ultimatum, and the Japanese obviously recognized it as such. So many historians have sort of wondered why we decided to get tough with Japan at this time, especially because our Philippine defenses were not ready. From a purely American perspective, we want to buy maybe 6 months so that we can move more stuff in there. But the problem is it's more important to keep Japan off Russia's back. So now it's time to be tough. And so we pay the price for that. Even as late as December 5th, FDR wonders whether the Japanese are moving against the Soviets. Secretary of the Navy Knox says that the Japanese fleet is at sea, thinks it's moving south to invade the Indonesia. And FDR says, not absolutely certain that they are not going north. You don't have information that they're not going north. So even to the last days before the war, he is still concerned that the Japanese are going to attack the Russians. And it is unfortunate that the US was unprepared for war during the period of maximum danger to the Soviets. And we had to accept rather painful consequences at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines. But it should be noted that the most painful consequences were suffered by the European colonial empires, the British, the French, and the Dutch, who got conquered. And but to FDR, he wants to get rid of colonial empires anyway, so that's actually a feature, not a bug. All right, so to summarize this phase of what I'm going to talk about, Soviets faced a two-front war threat from 1933 to 41, which actually continued into 42, but that's a different presentation. The Soviets sought to keep Germany and Japan divided diplomatically and diverted elsewhere militarily. The German invasion of the Soviet Union faced the United States with the prospect that Japan would unite with the Germans to crush the Soviets and dominate Eurasia. Roosevelt's policy in the last 6 months of 1941 was to divert Japanese attention to the South so that they would not be able to attack the Soviet Union. And as from July of 41 to December of 41, the increasing crisis in US-Japanese relations was the product of the military crisis on the Eastern Front. Every time things got worse on the Eastern Front, we dialed up the crank on the Japanese a little bit more. And the ultimate product of this policy was the attack on Pearl Harbor and war with Japan. So that's kind of the big picture, but I also had some observations on the how much of a disaster was Pearl Harbor. Because I was thinking about from, like a 75-year perspective, 80-year. The effect of the attack was, as we know, 2,400 Americans were killed, 2 battleships permanently destroyed, 6 of them were damaged, so they went hard after the battleships. 3 cruisers damaged out of 8 in harbor, 3 destroyers damaged out of 30, and some auxiliary ships were hit, but and a bunch of aircraft destroyed. If you were looking at that from the standpoint of overall naval losses in World War II, our losses at Pearl Harbor were permanent losses, were not that bad. 2 battleships. All the other naval powers lost at least 2 battleships. The Germans and Japanese, and it lost all their battleships. And the British also had the distinction of losing 2 battleships in one day, just like we did at Pearl Harbor. And but it's also noteworthy that we didn't lose any battleships after Pearl Harbor. Now, the salvage and repair of what were the Pearl Harbor attack, there were 100 ships moored at Pearl Harbor. 19 of them were sunk or damaged in the attack. All but 3 of them were eventually put back into action. As we know, the Arizona and the Oklahoma battleships were never put back in action. The Utah was a target ship that they just didn't bother. The rest of them, the West Virginia and California didn't get back in action until 44, but everything else pretty much back in action by 1942, which is not looking all that disastrous to me at all. Now, from the standpoint of the Battle of Production, you already made this observation that Pearl Harbor did not significantly hinder the expansion of our fleet, and huge forces were already in the pipeline, as we knew, and as the Japanese also knew. So even if the Japanese had done a much more punishing attack at Pearl Harbor, we've still got all this stuff coming, and we're still going to smack them down eventually. Now, if you were looking at the 2,400 casualties from the overall standpoint of World War II, the Navy and Marine Corps deaths at Pearl Harbor were 1.3% of overall deaths in World War II, which perhaps, not a lot, but at the same time, it happened in one day, where all the rest of them happened over 4 years. If you were looking at it from the standpoint of losses in individual naval actions, you would see that we lost more men in subsequent victorious actions, Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, but we usually, if you look down at the bottom, when we win a battle, we inflict far more casualties on the enemy than we suffer in return, as you would expect. And there were some other naval battles that were even more lopsided, British against the Germans, British against the Italians. If you were looking at it from the standpoint of total losses in the loss of an individual ship, this is kind of the top, 100 killed in ship losses in World War II. You see Arizona is, it's large, but it's by no means at the top. Lots of the other countries lost more men in individual ship losses. Here's the trivia question for the day. What was the largest loss of life from a single ship sinking in World War II? Does anybody know? Say? You got it, okay. The Wilhelm Gustloff was sunk in January of 1945. 9,400 dead, most of them women and children being evacuated. So that was 4 Pearl Harbors in one ship. Now, if you were looking at it from the standpoint of just British and American ships, yeah, that's bad. Like the British took 2 worse losses, but I would argue that if the Arizona's magazine had not been hit and the Oklahoma had not capsized, casualties on these ships could well have been much lighter. If you notice the casualties on the other battleships, not all that bad. And we have already heard that some of that was due to what you might call negligence or unpreparedness on the part of the commanders on the scene. If you look at Pearl Harbor compared to land battles, when you go fight protracted ground warfare, you're going to take a lot of casualties. And so Pearl Harbor is not huge compared to subsequent ground combat. In 1944 and 1945, we were losing 500 people a day. So Pearl Harbor was about 4 days of losses by those standards. If you look at it compared to the Eastern Front, the Soviets were losing huge numbers of people every day for almost 4 years. So every day on the Eastern Front was much more disastrous for Pearl Harbor than Pearl Harbor for the Russians. So to put it in perspective, Pearl Harbor, the attack put the battleship force temporarily out of action, though the battleships did return to combat later in the war for the most part. The attack largely ignored the surface forces, like the cruisers and destroyers that would play a key role in the subsequent battles in the Solomons, so I think it was a mistake not to go after those. The loss of 2 battleships was pretty unlucky, but Every other nation in World War II suffered similar or greater losses, and otherwise the Japanese attack was not terribly effective, only damaged a few cruisers and destroyers. Naval production already in the pipeline would have overwhelmed the Japanese, even if the Japanese had done a lot better at Pearl Harbor. And the personnel losses at Pearl Harbor were chiefly remarkable because they occurred on a single day. We would subsequently lose more men in larger ground and naval battles, and we'd be losing lots of men every day for the last 2 years of the war. So that's it for today.